With so many pressing issues on our plate, just very frustratingly to us, the Democrats are delaying that work even further with a political show vote. They're forcing a political show vote on the Epstein files. So we're just going to address that right at the top here this morning because they've spent so much time, the Democrats have, spinning the facts and trying to confuse the people that I wanted to come in this morning and just clearly explain for the people back home how we got here and why this vote is happening right now. First, a quick review of the relevant history here. For 4 long years under the previous administration, under the Biden-Harris administration, Democrats insisted there was no border crisis. Remember, they told you that that wasn't a problem at all. They dismissed inflation as transitory. That's what they told us. They told the American people not to believe what we could all see with our own eyes, that there was an obvious mental and physical decline.
Okay, so we need to talk about what just happened to Speaker Mike Johnson, because this represents a complete and humiliating public defeat that exposes his weakness as a leader, demonstrates that even his own party doesn't respect or follow him, and forces the comprehensive release of Epstein files that Johnson and Trump have been desperately trying to keep hidden. Johnson spent months trying to prevent or delay the Epstein files legislation, coordinating with Trump and with DOJ to find ways to block or water down the transparency mandate. He publicly predicted that the Senate would amend the House bill to add protections that would allow continued withholding of sensitive information, sensitive meaning damaging to Trump and his associates. But the Senate completely ignored Johnson's wishes and his predictions, passing the House version of the bill unchanged with unanimous support, which means the bill goes directly to Trump for signature without any opportunity for Johnson to influence it further. That unanimous Senate vote, including from Republicans who theoretically should be loyal to Johnson as Republican Speaker, is a devastating repudiation, showing that Johnson has no authority even within his own party. And Johnson's visible panic when the Senate vote was announced, caught on camera for the world to see, demonstrates that he knew this defeat was catastrophic for him personally and for Trump's efforts to keep the Epstein files hidden. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
On the part of President Biden individually. And now, seemingly overnight, these same cast of characters, they've taken a sudden and urgent interest in the Epstein investigation. Suddenly, it's all in the name of transparency. That's what they're trying to tell us. But the truth is, the biggest proponents of this discharge petition were never actually interested in transparency or ensuring justice or protecting victims of this unspeakable tragedy, the Epstein evils. And how do we know that? Because the Democrats had every one of the Epstein files in their possession for the 4 long years of the Biden administration. The Biden Department of Justice had the files the entire time. And not a single one of the people who are so loud and animated right now, they never said anything about it for all those 4 years. None of them held press conferences. None of them demanded the release of the documents. And under Biden's DOJ, when they prosecuted just Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell.
So let's set the scene here, because understanding what Johnson tried to do and how completely he failed helps explain why this is such a humiliating defeat. Johnson's strategy was apparently to let the House bill pass with overwhelming support, because blocking it was politically impossible, but then to work behind the scenes to get the Senate to modify the bill in ways that would preserve some ability to withhold damaging information. He was counted on Senate Republicans to add amendments requiring redactions to protect national security or ongoing investigations or victim privacy, amendments that on their surface would sound reasonable, but that in practice would give DOJ discretion to continue hiding information about Trump. Johnson apparently had private conversations with Senate leadership where he lobbied for these amendments and where he received assurances that they'd be considered. But when it came time to actually vote, Senate Republicans joined Democrats in passing the clean House bill without any of the amendments Johnson wanted. That betrayal, because that's what it was, shows that Senate Republicans concluded that protecting the institution and responding to overwhelming public demand for transparency was more important than helping Johnson protect Trump. The House vote of 427-1 is itself remarkable because it shows that opposition to releasing the Epstein files was politically untenable. Only one House member, presumably a hardcore Trump loyalist willing to take political hit, voted against transparency. Every other member, including Johnson himself, and including many Trump loyalists, voted for the bill because they understood that voting against it would be political suicide. The near unanimous vote shows that public pressure for transparency on this issue was so intense that even MAGA Republicans who normally follow Trump's direction on everything couldn't defend him on this. Johnson's decision to vote yes despite his private opposition shows he understood the political reality, but his public statements criticizing the bill before voting for it created worst of both worlds. He alienated Trump by allowing the bill to pass while also looking weak and hypocritical for voting for something he just criticized. The bipartisan revolt and procedural outflanking that forced Johnson's hand shows that when members from both parties unite on something, they can overcome even speaker opposition. Democrats and some Republicans apparently coordinated to threaten discharge petitions or other procedural maneuvers that would have forced a vote on the Epstein Files bill, regardless of whether Johnson wanted one. Faced with choice between allow and vote on his terms versus having vote forced through procedures he couldn't control, Johnson chose the former. But that choice was really just accepting inevitable defeat in least damaging way possible. The fact that members were willing and able to organize this kind of pressure shows Johnson's weak hold on the House and shows that on certain issues, normal partisan loyalty breaks down. Johnson's attempt to slow walk the process before abruptly changing course and voting yes demonstrates the kind of weak, reactive leadership that loses respect from members. Strong leaders make decisions based on principles or strategy and stick with those decisions. Weak leaders waffle based on which way political winds are blowing at any given moment. Johnson's vacillation, first trying to delay, then criticizing the bill, then voting for it while explaining he had no choice, looks like the behavior of someone who's being pushed around by events rather than someone who's directing events. That impression of weakness is deadly for leaders because once members conclude you're weak and can be pushed around, they stop following your direction and start pursuing their own agendas. The explanation that none of us want to go on record as against transparency is revealing because it admits that the vote was about avoiding bad political optics rather than about doing the right thing. Johnson is essentially saying, I'm only voting for transparency because it would look bad not to, not because I believe in it. That kind of cynical admission to political calculation makes him look even worse because it shows he knows transparency is right, but would oppose it if he could politically get away with it. Leaders should lead from principle, not from fear of bad press. Johnson's admission shows he's following rather than leading. So why does Johnson's defeat on the Epstein files matter beyond just embarrassing him personally? Because it demonstrates that congressional will for transparency and accountability is strong enough to overcome both executive branch obstruction and Trump's political pressure. For months, Trump and his allies in DOJ and in Congress have been blocking full release of these files. But the combined pressure from the public, from media, from Democrats, and from enough Republicans who care about transparency has finally overcome that obstruction. The files are going to be released comprehensively within 30 days, which means the American people will finally learn the full truth about Trump's relationship with Epstein and about who else was involved in Epstein's criminal network. That information will inform voters, will enable accountability, and will demonstrate that Democratic pressure for transparency can work even against powerful resistance. All right, so let's dig into the specific Senate vote dynamics. What Johnson's defeat means for MAGA power in Congress, what the comprehensive file release will likely reveal, and why this represents a turning point in the fight over transparency and accountability. Because understanding these details shows this isn't just about one bill, but about broader shifts in power and in public demands for accountability. The Senate's unanimous passage of the House Epstein Files bill is extraordinary, given how divided the Senate normally is on partisan issues. When you can get every single senator from both parties to agree on something, it shows the political pressure is overwhelming and that opposition is completely untenable. Senate Republicans who might have privately wanted to help Trump by watering down the bill concluded they couldn't do so because the political cost will be too high. Their constituents are demanding transparency. Media is watching. The House vote was 427-1, which sets clear expectation that Senate should follow. Any senator who tried to block or amend the bill would have been attacked as protecting powerful people connected to sex trafficking. That's not a political position any senator wants to be in, so the path of least resistance was to pass the bill as written and let the consequences fall where they may. John Thune's declaration that the public's right to know outweighs all excuses reflects both genuine principle and political calculation. Thune is Senate Republican leader and theoretically should be coordinating with Johnson to advance shared Republican interests. But Thune apparently concluded that Johnson's interest in protecting Trump from Epstein revelations doesn't align with broader Republican interests in looking like they support transparency and accountability. Thune's public statement dismissing Johnson's objections is rebuke that shows Senate Republican leadership doesn't feel obligated to follow House Republican leadership's direction. That breakdown in coordination between House and Senate Republicans is another symptom of Johnson's weak leadership and of broader GOP dysfunction. The dismissal of Johnson's objections by Senate leadership is significant because it shows Johnson has no leverage to influence Senate actions. Normally, Speaker and Senate Majority Leader work together closely to coordinate strategy. But on this issue, Senate leadership ignored Johnson's input completely. That could be because they genuinely disagree with Johnson's position, but it also could be because they don't respect Johnson enough to care what he wants. Either way, the result is that Johnson couldn't protect Trump in the way Trump wanted him to. That failure will have consequences for Johnson's relationship with Trump and for Johnson's standing with MAGA base that views protecting Trump as the highest priority. The lightning speed with which the bill will become law, 30 days from signing, reflects congressional intent to force immediate disclosure and to prevent any further delays or obstruction. Typically, legislation gives agencies months or years to implement new requirements, but Congress knew that DOJ and Trump would use any available time to delay and obstruct. So they imposed a 30-day deadline that's extremely aggressive and that will force DOJ to act quickly or face contempt of Congress. That tight timeline shows Congress is serious about enforcement and won't tolerate further stonewalling. The embarrassment to GOP leadership from this episode extends beyond just Johnson. Senate Republican leaders, who may have privately assured Johnson they helped water down the bill, but who then voted for clean version, are now exposed as either having misled Johnson or as having failed to deliver on promises. Trump is embarrassed because his allies in Congress couldn't prevent legislation he opposes. DOJ leadership, including Bondi and Patel, are embarrassed because Congress is forcing them to release files they've been fighting to keep hidden. The whole MAGA political operation is exposed as unable to stop this transparency mandate despite controlling significant levers of power. Johnson's visible panic caught on camera will become an iconic image representing his failed speakership. Political leaders are judged partly on how they handle adversity. Leaders who maintain composure under pressure are respected even when they lose battles. Leaders who visibly panic when things go wrong lose respect quickly. Johnson panicking on camera when he learned the Senate passed the bill shows he's not in control, not confident, not projecting the strength that leaders need to project. That image will be used in attack ads, will be referenced in news coverage, will become shorthand for Johnson's weakness as Speaker. The rumors of MAGA backlash that filled the Capitol following the Senate vote reflect expectations that Trump and his hardcore supporters will blame Johnson for this defeat and will potentially move to remove him as Speaker. MAGA members who view protecting Trump as the paramount consideration will see Johnson's failure to stop the Epstein files release as disqualifying failure of leadership. They might move to vacate the chair, just like they did to Kevin McCarthy. Johnson is in very similar position to McCarthy, trying to manage unmanageable conference with incompatible factions, where any action alienates someone and where accumulating failures eventually become unsustainable. The lost speakership credibility that observers are describing reflects recognition that Johnson has failed at the core task of speakership, building and maintaining coalitions that can pass legislation. Leadership wants passed and block legislation leadership wants blocks. Johnson wanted to block or water down the Epstein files bill. He failed completely. That failure shows he doesn't have the political skill or authority to control outcomes. Once a speaker is seen as unable to deliver wins or prevent losses, members stop following that speaker's direction and start pursuing their own agendas. Johnson appears to have reached that point where he's lost effective control, even if he nominally retains the position. The GOP fragmentation that this episode exposes includes splits between Senate and House Republicans, splits between MAGA and traditional Republicans, splits between members in safe districts who can afford to be extreme and members in competitive districts who need to appear reasonable to swing voters. These fractures have been present for years, but this episode makes them undeniably visible. When Senate Republicans openly defy House Republican leadership on high-priority issue, it shows the party is not functioning as a coherent unit. When House members threaten procedural revolts against their own speaker, it shows complete breakdown of normal party discipline. The collapse of MAGA discipline shown by this episode is particularly significant because MAGA has been built on loyalty and discipline. The whole theory of MAGA power was that Trump could enforce loyalty through threat of primary challenges and that members would follow leadership direction out of fear. But on the Epstein files issue, that discipline broke down completely. Members calculated that public pressure for transparency and personal political survival outweighed loyalty to Trump or to MAGA leadership. Once that calculation becomes common, MAGA's power collapses because the fear-based loyalty that held it together is gone. The threat to permanently weaken MAGA's congressional grip reflects understanding that this defeat is an isolated incident, but rather symptom of deeper problems. MAGA coalition was always tenuous, held together by Trump's personality and by shared opposition to establishment rather than by coherent shared policy vision. As Trump's legal problems mount, as evidence of his misconduct becomes overwhelming, as defending him becomes politically untenable, the coalition is fracturing. This Epstein files defeat might be remembered as moment when MAGA's congressional power began irreversible decline. The transparency wave that this legislation represents extends beyond just Epstein files. The principle that Congress can force comprehensive disclosure of sensitive files over executive branch objections will apply to other contexts. Other sealed files relating to other scandals might now face similar pressure for release based on precedent established here. The norm that powerful people can keep their misconduct hidden behind government secrecy is being challenged and potentially overturned. That shift toward transparency is healthy for democracy, but threatening to anyone whose misconduct has been hidden. The biggest public document dump in years that will result from Epstein files release will include thousands of pages of investigative materials, witness statements, communications, financial records, and other documentation about Epstein's criminal network. Media organizations and researchers will spend months analyzing these documents, identifying new information, connecting dots, and revealing the full scope of how Epstein operated and who enabled or participated in his crimes. The sheer volume of information and the sustained media coverage it will generate will keep this scandal in headlines for extended period, making it impossible for Trump and others implicated to move past it. The new bar for congressional oversight being set by this legislation shows that Congress is reclaiming authorities that had atrophied during years of executive branch resistance. When Congress demands documents and executive branch refuses, Congress historically has often accepted that refusal after some pro forma complaints. But this legislation shows Congress willing to use its full authorities to compel disclosure regardless of executive branch objections. That assertiveness should deter future executive branch obstruction by showing that Congress will force compliance when necessary. The DOJ accountability that will follow file release includes accountability for DOJ's previous obstruction of release and for any improper political influence over investigations. When files show that DOJ was hiding information for political reasons rather than for legitimate law enforcement reasons, it will create pressure for reforms and for accountability for officials like Bondi and Patel who corrupted DOJ. The files themselves are just first step. What comes after in terms of accountability for the corruption surrounding the files is also significant. The redefining of bipartisan power that this episode demonstrates shows that when both parties unite on issue of transparency and accountability, they can overcome even presidential opposition. Trump tried to prevent this legislation and failed because bipartisan consensus was too strong. That shows limits of presidential power when Congress is unified and determined. Future presidents will understand they can't indefinitely obstruct transparency that Congress and public demand. The explosive revelations that comprehensive file release promises include detailed information about Trump's relationship with Epstein that goes beyond what's already public. The files reportedly contain flight logs, communications, witness statements, and other documentation showing the extent and nature of Trump-Epstein relationship. They likely identify other powerful people who were involved with Epstein. They probably reveal ways that Epstein's crimes were enabled by people who looked the other way or who actively helped him. All of this information will be politically explosive and will generate new investigations, new litigation, and new political consequences. Okay, so let's break down what happens next. Now that the Epstein files will be comprehensively released within 30 days, what it means for Trump, for Johnson, for DOJ, and for everyone who's been trying to keep these files hidden, because we're about to see one of the most significant transparency moments in modern American politics. First, and immediately, DOJ has 30 days to compile and release the files. That's extremely tight timeline that will require massive effort. DOJ will try to build in some redactions claiming victim privacy or national security or ongoing investigations. But Congress made clear the release should be comprehensive, and any attempts to over-redact will be challenged immediately. DOJ officials, including Bondi and Patel, who've been obstructing release, will now have to oversee the very disclosure they've been fighting against. That's humiliating for them and creates risk they might try to slow roll or otherwise undermine compliance. Congress will need to monitor closely and be prepared to enforce the deadline aggressively. The 30-day countdown to release creates timeline where in 1 month the public will learn comprehensive truth about Trump-Epstein relationship and about Epstein's broader network. That creates intense anticipation and media focus. Every day for next month will include countdown coverage. Speculation about what files will reveal will dominate news cycles. When files actually drop, media will have massive pre-planned coverage ready to go. The sustained attention over 30-day period, followed by comprehensive release, creates maximum political impact. For Trump personally, the comprehensive file release represents one of his most serious political vulnerabilities, becoming fully public. Trump has tried for years to minimize his Epstein connections, to claim they were casual acquaintances who rarely interacted, but files reportedly show much more extensive relationship, including social events, travel, communications, and potentially compromising situations. When that information becomes public with documentary evidence, Trump's denials will be exposed as lies. His political opponents will use the revelations extensively. Even some Trump supporters might reach breaking point when confronted with irrefutable evidence about his relationship with sex trafficker. For Johnson, this defeat might be career-ending blow to his speakership. He failed to deliver what Trump wanted. He looked weak and panicked. His own party defied him. MAGA base that expected him to protect Trump is angry at his failure. Moderate Republicans who want party to move past Trump might see Johnson as liability, who's too closely identified with MAGA. Johnson has few allies and many critics. The next crisis or failure might trigger motion to vacate that ends his speakership. He's in very precarious position. For Bondi and Patel, overseeing the release of files they fought to keep hidden creates impossible situation. If they comply fully and release comprehensive documentation, they're helping expose Trump and potentially themselves. If they try to sabotage or undermine the release, they face contempt of Congress and potential criminal charges for obstruction. Their only real option is to comply while trying to minimize political damage through messaging and spin, but the facts will speak for themselves regardless of spin. The political impact on 2026 elections will be substantial. Epstein revelations will dominate coverage in months leading up to elections. Democrats will use the information extensively in campaigns. Every Republican will face questions about Trump's Epstein connections and whether Trump should be disqualified from office. Candidates in competitive races will struggle to defend Trump or to distance themselves from him while still appealing to MAGA base. The sustained negative coverage will suppress Republican turnout and will give Democrats powerful issue to motivate their voters. The legal implications of file release include potential new investigations, new civil litigation, and new criminal charges based on what files reveal. If files identify people who enabled Epstein's crimes or who participated in them, those people face potential prosecution or at minimum civil lawsuits from victims. If files show Trump violated laws through his interactions with Epstein, it adds to Trump's legal jeopardy beyond his existing cases. The files could be legal evidence in multiple proceedings. The precedent about forcing transparency over powerful resistance will affect future battles over government secrecy. When Congress can compel release of files despite President, DOJ, and powerful interests trying to keep them hidden, it establishes that transparency can be forced when political will exists. Future transparency battles will reference this precedent. People trying to keep government secrets will understand Congress has tools to force disclosure when properly motivated. The credibility restoration for Congress that this represents is significant. For years, Congress has looked weak and ineffective, unable to enforce its authorities against executive branch resistance. But forcing Epstein files released despite all obstacles shows Congress can be effective when united and determined. That success might restore some public faith in Congress as an institution capable of oversight and accountability. The MAGA movement consequences include potential permanent damage to movement's credibility and power. The movement was built partly on claims of fighting against corrupt elites and protecting children, but Epstein revelations will show movement leader was friends with sex trafficker. That cognitive dissonance might break some MAGA adherents out of the cult, or at minimum will make recruiting new adherents much harder. Movement might survive in diminished form, or might collapse depending on how damaging revelations are. The Trump legal defense complications from file release include prosecutors in various cases gaining access to new evidence about Trump's character, judgment, and associations. While Epstein relationship might not be directly relevant to January 6 or election interference charges, it's character evidence that could be used to show pattern of corruption, poor judgment, and willingness to associate with criminals. Defense attorneys' jobs just got harder. The Republican Party reckoning that file release forces includes fundamental questions about whether the party continues supporting Trump despite what files reveal. If revelations are as damaging as expected, continuing to support Trump becomes morally untenable for anyone with remaining ethical boundaries. But abandoning Trump splits party and alienates MAGA base. Party faces impossible choice between defending indefensible or fracturing coalition. Many Republicans will make different choices, creating chaotic, incoherent party message. The media coverage strategy for file release will involve every major news organization assigning teams to analyze documents as soon as they're released. Pre-written explainers about Epstein and about Trump connection will be updated with new information. Timelines will be created. Witness statements will be highlighted. The most damaging information will lead coverage. The scale of media attention will ensure revelations reach broad public audience. The public demand for accountability that file release represents shows Democratic pressure can work to force transparency even against powerful resistance. Citizens demanded release, pressured Congress, sustained attention until Congress acted. That people power is foundation of democracy. When citizens demand accountability and sustain that demand despite obstacles, they can force system to respond. Here's the bottom line. Mike Johnson suffered devastating defeat when Senate unanimously passed Epstein files transparency bill, despite his efforts to block or water down it. Johnson's visible panic exposed his weakness. Senate Republicans defied House Republican leadership, showing Johnson has no authority even within own party. The 427-1 House vote showed opposing transparency was politically impossible, Epstein files will be comprehensively released within 30 days, revealing full truth about Trump-Epstein relationship and broader criminal network. Johnson's failure might end his speakership as MAGA backlash and moderate Republican frustration combine to make his position untenable. Trump faces major political vulnerability as relationship with sex trafficker becomes fully documented in public. Bondi and Patel must oversee release of files they fought to hide. GOP fragmentation is undeniable, with Senate and House at odds and MAGA discipline collapse. The legislation sets precedent for forcing transparency over powerful resistance. Media will provide comprehensive coverage of revelations. Legal and political consequences will flow from what files reveal. What happens next depends on exactly what revelations emerge, but file release marks major transparency victory and shows that public pressure and congressional will can overcome obstruction when sustained.